In the previous section, we learned about how useful the code interpreter, the brand new feature, can be in certain situations, right? It's not going to write you an application or anything, but you can upload files and ask questions about those files and ask for data analysis, data visualization, video processing, all sorts of things. Now we're going to talk about how regular old developers, so this is a section for people who have some technical experience, how regular developers can use ChatGPT on its own, and where it succeeds and excels and where it falls short. When it comes to coding with ChatGPT, I think of it more as an assistant, a helper, a co-pilot. It's what GitHub Copilot essentially is as well, but not as a true developer. Maybe that will happen one day. There are times it surprises me and it's quite impressive, but there are many more times it frustrates me or it provides bad code, incomplete code. It can't figure out how to connect specific libraries. So there are certain tasks it works really well at and other tasks that it definitely falls short. So the first thing you should know is that it just is not good at writing large pieces of code or applications in the same way that it's not good at working with large pieces of text, right? You can't feed it a super long Wikipedia article. It runs out of context. The same is true when it comes to code. So it generally works best when it's writing small self-contained pieces of code, functions, maybe a single file, a module. It can do that pretty reliably, especially if you give it specific requirements and even examples using one or few shot prompting. It is possible to use ChatGPT to write larger pieces of code or even try to use it to write an application for you, but you really have to know what you're doing as a developer and pay attention to what it's writing, because I've trialed this a bunch of times just to see how far I can push it. I've asked it to write games and applications with authentication, and it will give you some good stuff. And then at some point, it just goes off the rails. Or at some point, it forgets what it was doing before because you've written so much text and it's written so much code. So it is not ready at the moment to write you a full application from scratch unless you're doing something super simple. Write me an HTML and CSS Sudoku game. It can do something like that, but it is not ready to write large applications. So on this slide, you can see some of the various tasks color-coded, green, red, and yellow. The green things are things I recommend using ChatGPT for that it does very well at. Write me a function to do X, write me a module that does Y, create a class that does something. It's also really useful for debugging purposes. Please explain what's going wrong in this code. What does this error message mean? I got this weird AWS issue. I don't know how to fix it. Do you have any advice? It does pretty well in those situations, basically as a Stack Overflow clone on steroids. How can you improve this code, this algorithm, this file, the time complexity of this solution? It can do very well in those situations as well, where you're giving it something that's self-contained and asking it to fix it, improve it, critique it. It also does really well translating from one language to another or basically acting as a tutor. So I've been learning more Scala recently, and I frequently use ChatGPT, not just to translate things to Scala, but also to ask questions and ask it, treat it as if it was my Scala tutor, and it can be pretty helpful there. Where it does not do well, as I've already explained, is asking it to write a full-fledged application from scratch. With a caveat, if you're willing to work with it, if you have the technical know-how, if you want to try and coach it along the right path, you can get it to help you with larger pieces of code, but you have to ask very specific pointed questions. You have to be careful about how many tokens have been used in the context window, and you have to be very specific. So asking something like write me a chat application won't get you far. Asking it to help you start a chat application using Express and MySQL might get you started. It will give you something that you could start with, but it's not going to write an entire app for you, and you'll have to keep coming back, asking it follow-up questions, providing more context, reminding it of the code it's already written because it's already forgotten about it a couple minutes later. If you have a lot of stuff in your chat window, it will forget about the earlier stuff. So it takes some work. And this is just based on my experience. It is useful in a lot of situations relating to code, but it is not going to write full things for you, at least not yet. So I'm going to show some examples of how I like to use it, some real world examples in the next few videos. And this is, again, for people who have some technical knowledge. I'll mix it up, do some Python, do some JavaScript. It won't be specific to one language. So if you're a Python dev, don't worry. If you're a JS dev or something else, these are all going to be just pretty generic examples for any language. Next, I have some quick tips and strategies that will help you if you're using ChatGPT as a developer. And the first thing to keep in mind is that it is definitely an iterative process, especially if you're trying to write longer things. I already touched on this in the previous video. It doesn't work very well if you just tell it to write you an application. It works much better if you go slowly. You give it some context at the beginning. I'm trying to build this application. Here's the tools I want to use. Can you write this one piece first? Can you write this one route? Can you create the HTML for this one view? And then you can build it up as you go. And I'm going to show an example of that. But just keep that in mind, that it's not going to spit out something most of the time that is perfect and big. It will spit out perfect in small chunks like shell scripts and functions and standalone pieces. I use it for that all the time, and it usually works pretty well. For bigger things, it's very much try something, it doesn't work, try it again, and repeat process. The next tip is that it's often wrong. It happens a lot. It will generate code. I'll show examples of a time I got an infinite loop in the real world outside the context of making this course. I was working on a project where I was trying to use ChatGPT to help me. It gave me some code that seemed like it worked, and it was a complete infinite loop once I actually started using it to request an API, and I used up a whole lot of API credits, which is my fault, but it is wrong often. The good news is it's also very good at fixing things when it's wrong and you tell it that it's wrong. So one of the videos I have coming up is a very simple demonstration of that. I asked it to build this little animated HTML page where we have a logo bouncing around the screen from corner to corner, kind of like the old DVD screen, if you ever saw that. And it took 3 or 4 attempts of me trying, and it's like 50, maybe 30 lines of code, nothing big. And it was completely buggy, didn't work. It was stuttering. The image wouldn't move. And then I identified the issue and I told it, hey, it's not working. There's a bug and it's just stuttering on the screen, and it immediately fixed it. So I'll show that as a separate video, but just to give you a heads up, it often is wrong, which is not the end of the world if you are aware that it's often wrong, because it is pretty good at fixing code that it writes, especially if you can identify why something doesn't work. And then finally, a really important piece to keep in mind is the context window. Remember that every model, ChatGPT model, has a maximum context window, which is the amount of tokens basically that it can work with in terms of its input and output put together. And if you exceed that, you can run into problems if you're writing large applications or large pieces of code across multiple files, a really long conversation. By the end of that conversation, it often forgets or doesn't know what happened at the beginning, and it starts going off the rails and writing code that doesn't cohere to the rest of the code that it generated for you earlier. So this is something you want to be aware of, especially with longer things. It's true of any long chat that you have with ChatGPT, but I've found that when I'm working with code, those tend to be the longest types of chats that I have, especially with bigger applications. So the model will start to forget about things and generate nonsense. One strategy, aside from just being aware of this, knowing about the context window, knowing that if you get too many tokens, too many words in a chat, it isn't able to process all of them. One specific strategy is to tell ChatGPT to only generate you code and not generate explanations. Because what it often will do is give you here's a function that's 10 lines, and then here's 50 lines of me or the model explaining how the function works, what it does, what the parameters are. And you may not actually need that. It's just extra content that's taking up your tokens. So that is one strategy we'll also employ later when I show you an attempt at building something larger with ChatGPT. And I say attempt because it doesn't work perfectly to build applications. But we'll start off in this section taking a look at some things where it does excel at: writing functions, writing shell scripts, writing small pieces of functionality. That's coming up. So the first use case we'll look at is asking ChatGPT to help us write basic functions. And I'm not talking about, a function to add two things together, although we definitely can do that. But I'll try and show a realistic example. We'll start with a very trivial example, maybe multiplying two numbers together, which is technically not adding them together, but then I'll show something that I actually have used personally. I'm going to try and keep some of this grounded in the real world. It's so much easier as a teacher to just say, write a function that adds two numbers and call it a day. But I do want to show some things that prove that it can be useful in the real world. So I'm drawing from my own personal experience using ChatGPT over the last few months. Okay. So just like with any prompt, we need to give it a little bit of context. We don't really need to say, like, you are an expert developer. It's pretty good at writing code. So we can simply say, I need you to write me, let's pick a Python function that expects two numbers and returns the product of the two numbers. I mean, very, very basic. We really don't need ChatGPT to do this, assuming you have some developer experience. Now, this is regular old ChatGPT, not the interpreter. It's giving me the code and showing me how to use it, but then I still, of course, have to run this myself and test it out. And with anything ChatGPT gives us, we definitely want to try it just before incorporating it into any code base. That's a no-brainer, just like you would try any function you find on Stack Overflow. And it does work pretty well in most situations, including really basic functions that, it certainly has come across this exact function in its training data set, but also in novel functions that it maybe has not come across. So something I had to do recently was rename a ton of files. Specifically, I had a bunch of numbered files. They're actually course lectures I had created, and they were in this format where I have a big course, maybe with 100 or 200 lectures, and I number them as I go, 1 and 2, 3, 4. I'm using text files for this demo, but when I actually ran this a couple weeks ago, I had already done this using video files, and I just don't want to mess with them right now. I'll leave my video files alone because they are correctly named. Anyway, what I did, kind of a naive thing for how long I've been making these courses, I normally label my course videos like this. In section 1, I'll have 011 .mp4, and then I'll have 012, and those will all be in section 1. And then in section 2, I have 0201 .mp4, for example. And the reason I do it this way is because Udemy has a bulk uploader where I can upload 100 videos at once and then attach them to lectures after I've uploaded. The problem is, if I name my videos like this, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then I have in a separate section 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and another section 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, I cannot figure out which video is which. I'll upload them all, and there'll be like 10 videos, one from each section, that has the name 1, and then another 10 videos from each section that has the name 2. So what I want to do is basically take the folder name, like right here, and rename this lecture to be 4_1. And this one would be 4_2, 4_3. It would be simple enough to do this myself, but I just asked ChatGPT to help me with it. So I basically wrote a prompt that says, I have the following file structure. And then I tried to diagram it here, where I have a folder with the name of 1. And then inside that folder, I have 1.txt, 2.txt, 3.txt. And then I have a folder called 2. And inside of that, I have 1.txt. And I'll just leave it off at 2.txt. And then below that, write me a Python script that I can run to rename all the files in a directory to be prefixed with the number of the directory, maybe the parent directory. Then move all the files into a single new directory called ready to upload or something like that. So I wanted to take this structure and write code that can loop over all of the directories, which I might need to coach it with because it might just assume I only want these 2 directories. Take the name of each directory and prefix each lecture, each file, with that number. So 2_1, 2_2. So I might even show it the format. The lectures or the files should have names like 1_1.txt and 1_2.txt. So I'll show an example of the end format I want. Let's see what it does. It might need more information. Okay, so it starts by making my directory called ready to upload if it doesn't yet exist. List all the directories in the current working directory. If it is a directory, list all the files. And then perfect, this is exactly what we want. This line right here, if you're not familiar with Python, this is an F string. It interpolates the name of the directory underscore the name of the file, and then it moves them all into this directory. Now let's see. It says you're running it, I assume you're running it in the parent directory of the 1 and 2 directories. That's what I want. So let's try this. I'm going to make a new script in here called, rename files.py. I put the script that it gave me in rename files, so it's in there. And now I'm going to try executing it. And let's see what happens. Okay, it looks like some stuff happened. These directories are now empty, which I did tell it to move them. I could have said make a copy, but I was dealing with video files originally, which were large, like hundreds and hundreds of gigs of video, so I didn't want to do that. And now, instead of ready to upload, perfect. I have 4_x. I have 3_ each one of my lectures, 2_ and so on. It did exactly what I wanted. So I did this in the real world, like I said, but I was using video files, and then I could take this entire folder and upload it all to Udemy at once using the bulk uploader tool, and I didn't have to worry about name collisions, and it was very easy as I went section by section to identify the correct videos once they were uploaded. So just a simple example, but this is the sort of thing that ChatGPT is really useful for in my day-to-day life as a developer. I could write this function. It would just take some time. Why not try something using ChatGPT and save that time? As we've already discussed, one of the things that ChatGPT excels at as far as code-related prompting is generating standalone discrete scripts, functions, classes, things that exist on their own. And one of the most common use cases that in my own daily developer life I turn to ChatGPT for is writing simple shell scripts or even just a shell one-liner. I've published courses on Unix commands, where I cover like 50 or 60 different commands and how to combine them, how to write your own shell scripts. But it takes time, and I only remember like half of them on my best days without having to research some of the different commands. So by using ChatGPT, I can really quickly create utility scripts and just one-liners that are useful, that don't require 5, 10, 15 minutes of digging around and playing, but instead just a single query to ChatGPT. So a really simple one to start would be on a Mac. Everyone on a Mac gets these pesky hidden DS store files, these system files. So here's a directory. I have one there. I didn't make it. My Mac just adds it in there. Let's see, I think there's at least, here's another one nested in my routes directory in this folder. Let's take a look at the views directory. Okay, there's not one here. How about in my models directory? Yep, there's a DS store file. And these are just annoying. I mean, you can add them to a git ignore, and that makes it easy enough. However, if I want to just remove them all, so that they're not cluttering my workspace or not showing up in my videos, I could write a script to do that. And it's probably going to involve RM and possibly find, but I could also ask ChatGPT to do it for me or write a script for me. Write a command line script, can I zoom in a bit, to remove all DS store, there's a dot in front of it, files from my Mac within a given directory and all nested folders. Let's imagine there's 5 or 6 layers of these folders and they all have a DS store. Yep, so it is, I see, this is what I'm talking about. I forgot there's a delete option for the find command. And I've taught the find command. I've made videos, many videos on it, but there's just too much to remember. So before you use something like this, it's always good to understand what it's doing and if it looks good to you or not. There are many times ChatGPT will come up with something completely wrong. I'll show you a cautionary tale shortly in the next video or two. Okay, so I just ran the command. Although I did run it in the wrong directory, I was nested down one layer. So let me try it again. Okay, so now there's no DS store file in here. And if I look in the, where else was one? The routes folder, there's no DS store here. And presumably, however many nested layers of DS stores I have all the way down 10, 20 folder levels down, if I had that, they'd all be removed. So here's another example straight from the real world. Something that happens a lot when I'm making a course is that I'm not sure how long the course is as I'm creating it. I'll export a bunch of videos. So here's one example actually for this very course you're watching right now. These are the exports for one of the sections on ChatGPT basic sort of prompting, blueprint, right? Things we talked about, providing the context, input data, output format. Anyway, I have all the MP4s and I just want to have a rough idea, or I guess a precise idea of how long this section is, because it's kind of a pain to upload my videos to Udemy where it will actually start, telling me how long the course is. So what I'd like to do is have a script to start, at least, that will just take one directory of videos and tell me how long all these videos are. And then ideally, I could run it on the overall course directory that has a bunch of nested course folders. And then it could tell me up to date right now, every time I run it, just a little command line script, you are at 8 hours or 7 hours or 20 hours, because that makes a big difference on how I approach a course. If things are getting way too big too quickly, which has happened, I end up having to re-record things, slim it down so that I'm not making like a 30-hour course or a 40-hour course. Anyway, I'm just going to ask ChatGPT to help me with that. Can you write me a simple shell script that will, let's go with sum the durations of all videos within a specific directory? And I think I want to avoid doing any standalone shell scripts here. Instead, I'm just going to ask it to make me a one-liner. But realistically, I would put this in a file, make it an executable, and be able to run it, with some sort of name that I give it, like, I don't know, calculate length, current length, something like that, curlen. Okay, so it is giving me a bash script, which is fine. But then I'm going to ask it, can you instead make that a one-liner? And this is, again, this iterative process that we'll talk more about, where it's a conversation going back and forth with ChatGPT to arrive at the actual end result that behaves the way I want it to. So here's what it's given me. It's using the find command. It's using something called ffprobe. It's then looking for the duration. And then it's using the paste command, which doesn't really work well on a Mac. So I'll just run this. I will have to replace this path to directory with the current directory, just dot, because I'm already in that folder. And actually it looked like it worked okay this time. Interesting. That's good to know. I was having trouble with the paste command a couple days ago. But it does look like I can only assume this is a duration in seconds. There's no way that these, 8 videos are 2,000 minutes. So then I could ask it, can you rewrite it to give me the duration in seconds? Sorry, minutes. Now, it's just going to divide by 60. It would be simple enough to add that on ourselves. But again, we're having a conversation with it and improving things as we go. Okay, so it adds in an echo, wraps everything, and then divides by 60 at the end. Let's try that. Replace the path to the directory with dot, which is the current folder. And it gives me 35 minutes. Okay, so I'll verify independently after this. Just do the math. I'll add them up together and tell you if that's correct. And indeed, it is correct. I just summed it up manually. The videos are slightly longer than 35 minutes total, but it's rounding down to 35, which is fine. But if we look at my folder structure here, it's kind of a mess. But this is a peek into the disaster of my course structure, organization, file structure, all that stuff. If I look at one of these, like the code interpreter section, it includes a bunch of screen flow files, which is the software I use to record the actual videos. Then I export them into a folder, in this case called interpreter exports. And then I have all my MP4 files. So what I wanted to do is work with all of the MP4 files it finds within this directory. And we can try running it as is. So I'll go to the parent directory of my entire course, which is this folder here called ChatGPT course. And I'm going to try running the command. Where are you? This one. And let's see if it does work, if it finds all of the videos. And it's unhappy because the way that it's doing find right now is that it's just taking every single file. So it's not going to work. I want it to only work with the MP4 files because this package or this tool, FFprobe, I believe works only with video files, but it's finding a bunch of weird files like a DS store file, a bunch of ScreenFlow files, right? All the files that I've made that are not videos. So I'm going to ask it again, can you rewrite it to specifically look for .mp4 files? And it's just going to change the find command. There we go. We use -name, use the wildcard character with .mp4. This will basically say find all the files nested in this directory that have .mp4 at the end of their name. And then I'll just change this to be dot because I'm running it in the current directory. Let's clear and let's see what happens. Just doing some recursive searching and finding, and hopefully, there we are, 584 minutes, which at this point, when we get to this size, I may actually prefer it in terms of hours, which, what I would probably do is turn this into an actual shell script I could run with different options, one for M, minutes, one for H, hours. And this is accurate. This is saying I think that's 9.7 hours, 9.6 hours, which is exactly, I've actually uploaded most of the content to Udemy already, so I do know that it is 9 point something hours. Okay, so pretty nifty, just a simple example, but could I have written this? Sure. It would have taken, this is the easy part, finding the MP4s. Using this FFprobe package or script, I've never used it, but it apparently will extract the duration of a video. That's one of the options. And then we sum them all together and divide by 60, and there we are, 584 minutes. This is the sort of thing that I think ChatGPT is really good at and can enhance pretty much any developer's workflow, not just shell scripting, but that's a common one where, you could be a Python master, a JavaScript master, a Java master, whatever, but shell scripting is its own thing that almost everyone has to worry about at some point. And for me, even though I've taught courses on it, it's still hard to remember most of the stuff, to be honest. And ChatGPT just made it very easy. I just had to go back and forth with it a couple times to improve the initial command it gave me. And finally, it probably would have been best just to go with a shell script from the beginning, put this in a script, make it an executable, give it some sort of name. That would have been nice. But I just wasn't sure if everyone was comfortable and familiar with doing that. So I just asked it to give me a one-liner instead. But then, of course, I have to remember this one-liner and copy and paste it every time, which is the whole point of creating our own executables. I can give them a name and run this as, calc duration, cur duration, something like that. Get minutes, get hours. Anyway, so here's one more example. Another thing, this is from the real world, that I asked ChatGPT to help me with was creating a script that would tell me how much I added to my computer's file system, how much space I took up today. Because it's a long story, but I now live in a place with pretty bad internet, and I used to be able to keep everything in the cloud and have no issues, and making courses, can be terabytes of data. Now, with my internet, I'm constantly worried about how much I'm adding to my disk and how much a course is taking up. And specifically, I want to know day by day how much I'm adding. So it's a little tricky. So I asked it to write me a shell script that tells me how much space I've taken up on my hard drive today. It's tricky because not all systems actually track when something was created. Usually Unix-based systems will only track when things were last modified. So it's not entirely accurate. If I go back and modify something I made a week ago, it will be included in this count if I modified it today. But anyway, here's the script that it wrote. It's very simple. It uses disk utility, so du right here. It uses find. By default, it is finding everything in my root directory, which is going to include all sorts of system files and things that I didn't touch myself. So I think I'm going to rewrite it to work in the current directory. I'll change this to be dot. And then let's just say that you're not sure how to set this up as your own bash script, if that's in fact what I want. I want it to be an executable. So I'm going to say, how do I go about making this script an executable? And it will give me instructions. So I have to add the shebang at the top of the script, which is actually already in here. Okay, and that just declares that this is a bash script file. And then I need to save it to a file. Okay, name it whatever I want. Give it a .sh extension, not required. And then finally, I need to use the chmod command, which I can use to change file permissions. Use the +x to add executable permissions, and then I can run my script this way. And if I want to be able to run it from anywhere, I'm going to have to move it to a directory in my path. This is all covered, by the way, in my Linux course if you want to learn more about that. But I know earlier in this video I said I'm just going to keep this simple and do one-liners. And then I kind of had second thoughts because I thought, well, some people might actually want to know how to do this for real and how to make this something usable anywhere. So if you're one of those people, you can just ask ChatGPT for help. Anyway, I will take this script that it wrote me, although now it went back to doing a one-liner, which I don't want. So I'm just going to take the original script that it wrote here. It's a pretty simple script, and I'm going to go to my user local bin. Okay, I will touch a new file. You can see a bunch of different commands in here. I'm going to make mine called space. Maybe, is that what I want to call it? Sure. I'll call it space or storage or something like that. And then I'll do space.sh. And then I'll just use nano on space.sh. I'll paste my script in here. And then if you've never used nano, it's just a simple text editor built in to most Unix shells. And then I will save this using Control O to write it out. And then I'll quit with Control X. All right, so if I look at that, cat space.sh, there it is. That's my script. Next, I simply have to make it executable. So chmod plus x will add executable permissions, and it's called space.sh. Great. And now let me open up a new tab, and I can verify that it works by doing which space.sh. This will just tell me we found it. There it is, user local bin. Now we'll go to the directory that has my course that I'm currently working on, this very ChatGPT course, and I'm going to run space.sh. And I had to stop it because I realized, again, it was going through the entire root directory. So I'm going to reopen this in nano and change this line to be the current directory I'm running it in with the dot, and then write that out with Control O, rename it, and Control X to quit. Now I try it again. And right now what it's showing me is that I've touched 1.5 gigs. I've either created or modified 1.5 gigs of data in this particular folder today. So if I go into a different folder, let's just burrow down into something I did a long time ago, like the basics. This is all about making your account for ChatGPT, the interface, the fact that there's a training cutoff. That was one of the first things I recorded. If I run my command in here, it actually doesn't give me anything. I didn't touch anything in that directory. I didn't modify or create any files in there today. All right. So that's all I want to show is you can definitely set up real fully fledged scripts too if you don't want them to be one-liners. I just wasn't sure if everyone was on board with how you go about doing that. but you can ask ChatGPT and it gives you a very usable explanation. In this video, I'm going to show a real-world example from my own life as a developer outside of making this course. So this is not a contrived thing, just manufactured to show some concept or illustrate something in this course. This is real, and it has to do with the fact that often ChatGPT will just give you broken, buggy, or just flat-out wrong code, especially on its early attempts. But if you can identify the issue or even just tell it that it's wrong, it often will fix it and respond with working code. And that's exactly what happened here. And I'll show another example of this. We're going to make a little DVD animation thing where a logo bounces around the screen, and it got it wrong a bunch of times and then fixed it. So I was working on a project using an API, and this API supported batch upserts, where I could send off a whole bunch of data at once. So I had a whole bunch of data. I was using Python, and by the way, this is a paid API where every transaction costs some money. And I wanted to try and minimize the number of upserts that I was performing, but I had to figure out how to group my data into batches of the correct size without trying to upsert something that was too big or leaving space where I could have filled that space in the API call. So I started out with explaining that I was working in Python. I just want to tell you that because down here, I just keep going without ever saying I want this to be in Python. But I asked it to write a method that takes a generator, a Python generator, and a batch size, and returns lists of that size or fewer until the generator is exhausted. Take a generator and then split it up into lists of a certain size, this batch size parameter. So it gave me a function that seemed like it worked. It even gave me, an example of it and the output that I would expect, which is what I wanted, right? If I provide this generator to it, in a batch size of 3, it gives me lists of size 3, and then a final list of size 1, because there wasn't enough elements to fill a list up to that size of 3. So I'll just demonstrate this. And if you're not familiar with Python and generators, that's okay. Just know that this is the output I'm expecting. Basically, not an infinite loop. And it seemed to work. And that is where I made a mistake because I trusted this. I didn't even really bother looking at the code, which was my fault completely. Then I went off and tried to use this in the real world with the API that I was working with. And turns out there was an infinite loop. And I kept upserting a ton of data over and over and over and over. So here's another example. So this just keeps going and going and going, and this is not making API calls or anything. It's just a demonstration that, okay, let me interrupt the process. I got an infinite loop. So I responded with that exact fact. This gave me an infinite loop. And just like I said on the slides earlier, it often will just correct itself. You don't have to tell it exactly why it gives you an infinite loop. If you just tell it infinite loops, it often will fix itself. So it gave me a better version. So I'll just demonstrate this now. Oops, I don't have Python open. Oh dear. Okay, let me open up Python again. I'll paste this in and I'll rerun the line that was giving me an infinite loop right here. Now it no longer gives me an infinite loop and it works just fine. So don't be surprised if it gives you code that's completely incorrect. You'll see actually quite a few examples of that in this section. In the last video in this section, we build a very simple web application with Flask. It's a URL shortener, and it keeps using the wrong function and the wrong parameters for the SQL Alchemy library. And it keeps basically breaking. And then I call it out and say, hey, I'm getting an error. And then it corrects itself and says, oh, shoot. You have to call this within a specific context, or you can't call it with parameters. And it happens 2 or 3 times with the exact same one function call that it just gets caught up on. So it's often wrong at first, but if you call it out, you tell it there's a bug, it's wrong, it's an infinite loop, whatever, it often can fix itself. It's not a guarantee, but just know that as a developer, be careful with the code that it gives you and don't do what I did. Another use case as a developer for ChatGPT that I turn to sometimes is converting code from one language to another, which I could show you an example of, a dumb multiply function or addition function in JavaScript and ask for it to be written in Python. Sure. But this is a real example from last week, 2 weeks ago, where I was working with the Udemy API and I was just playing around with it with curl. So right here is how I was making a request to the API. Obviously, I had my secret token in there, but I didn't feel like providing that to ChatGPT. Then I just asked for it to convert the curl request. So if you're not familiar with curl, it's a command line utility to make requests, HTTP calls. And this was working fine, but I was ready to start doing it in Python. I just wanted to test if the API worked before trying to deal with a Python script and virtual environments and all this stuff. So I simply said, can you convert this curl to a requests library call in Python? The name of the library I wanted to use is called requests, and that's exactly what it did. It imported requests, it made me the Python script, and then it just prints out the JSON at the end if I want it. But then I wanted it to be a function. So I asked it to add variable arguments so I could supply some query params. Once again, iterative prompting here, starting simple, and then adding in some additional functionality, and it gave me an even better function. It even used types in here, which I didn't ask it to do, but it put types in there for me, made me this function, Udemy instructor API call. It expects a path, a secret token, and then params as a dictionary that's optional. And so now I can provide my params, and it will pass them through to the request as it's making them. And again, this is something any Python developer could write, but this just makes it super easy and super quick. So just an example of converting from one language to another. Additionally, I had the same chat session open now that I'm just sharing my chats with you. It feels very vulnerable here. This is completely separate, but I was getting back this date string in this format, and I wanted to parse it reliably. And I hate dealing with dates, so I asked for some help, and I said, can you help me reliably parse it? Here's the format. And it helped me. It gave me some Python code to do exactly that, right? Using the datetime package or the datetime library, we provide the date string and provide this format. I mean, these things are so dense and annoying to look at. I mean, I know year and month, but I can never remember the capitalization and all the different variations for how you work with these date times and represent them as strings to parse them. It gave me a great explanation, and I incorporated this into my code, and it worked great. So unrelated, but just a little sidebar there, just to show that I do use this pretty frequently. Here's another example from the real world of me using ChatGPT to convert not necessarily one language to another, but one framework to another. I started an app using Fast API, which is a Python web development framework, and I decided halfway through I wanted to switch over to Flask, which is another Python web development framework or web app framework. So I just said, rewrite the following Fast API app as Flask. I provided very simple application here, just a couple routes, 50, 60 lines of code, and it rewrote it for me perfectly in Flask, and it worked on the first attempt. Again, something that most developers could do pretty easily, at least if you're familiar with Fast API and Flask. Wouldn't take that long, but it'd take 15, 20 minutes or so, and it did it for me just in a matter of seconds. And then it gave me a nice explanation telling me exactly what it did, which would be really useful if you're somebody who, let's say, knows Fast API but is not familiar with Flask. It explains some of the key differences, the different ways that the route decorators work in Fast API versus Flask, for example. Another use case for converting one language to another, one framework or library to another, is purely educational. I've been learning Scala recently, and it is quite the beast to learn, at least for me, compared to a lot of the other languages I know. And I've been using ChatGPT almost like a tutor at times, where I'll take some Python code or JavaScript code, something like this function here. So this is a memoize to file function that it's a decorator that caches the output of a method into a JSON file, cache.json, and just going to copy this here. It doesn't really matter if you understand the function, if you even write Python, but this is a function that I wrote a while ago for a different course. And then I'll go over to ChatGPT and say something like, I'm trying to learn Scala as a Python developer. Convert this Python function to a Scala function. And this is the important part for the learning process, and highlight any key differences between the languages. and then I'll include the code, and then I wait. So it's going to write me a bunch of code. We'll see a whole bunch of weird imports. If you don't know Scala at all, don't worry about it. But then it's going to write my function. So Scala doesn't actually support decorators. We can do a higher order function. This is a decorator in Python. It's not really a thing in Scala. But anyway, it writes my code. I think it's still going. And then it shows me the key differences. The type system, function arguments, currying, JSON parsing, file handling, hashing, mutability, null safety, lambda function, that there's not an equivalent to star args that we have in Python. Anyway, this is just a direct translation that it gave me, and it does mention it could be refactored to be more idiomatic. Can you make it more idiomatic, Scala, instead of just a direct line-by-line translation? And this is something I truly have been doing just on my own as I'm trying to learn a language. It's one thing to write a function yourself and rewrite it line by line, keeping it exactly the same from JavaScript to Python, Python to Scala, whatever. It's another to then ask ChatGPT to make it more Pythonic or more Scala-ish or more JavaScript-ish. And so it suggests some improvements to leverage some of Scala's features. And there we are. Here's our better results. Now, I'm not going to run this. I'm not going to bore you with Scala, but it shows me a list of changes and an explanation as to why one result is more idiomatic Scala versus the initial. So this is something I honestly truly do, and it's acted basically as a tutor, a coach, as I learn a new language. Next, I'd like to show an example of something, I guess it's slightly larger, but it's not very big. It just has a couple of different files instead of working on a single script or a single, function at a time. I'm going to ask ChatGPT to generate me a website, an HTML file essentially, that mimics the DVD logo bouncing around on the screen that I used to see as a kid. Something like this, which maybe some of you have seen this, although depending on how young you are, you might only know it from a famous scene in The Office, but it's just some sort of image bouncing around on a screen. It should be some simple JavaScript, a little bit of CSS, and a little bit of HTML. Nothing very difficult. So I'm going to ask it to create me, let me just make sure, okay, good. Create me an HTML website that displays a bouncing DVD logo that moves and bounces across the entire screen. It should have a black background. Let's see if that's enough information. Okay, so it does know that it needs HTML, it needs some CSS, and it needs some JavaScript. This example does not use a real DVD logo. We'll have to replace that with whatever our DVD icon is. So the first thing that it does that's kind of annoying is that it puts all of the content in a single HTML file. It inlines, well, it doesn't inline, but it adds the styles using a style tag, and it adds the JavaScript using a script tag. That's easy enough for us to fix, or we could even just ask it to please not do that and instead give us multiple files. But let's try running this and just see what happens. I'll have to add some sort of image or something that will bounce around the screen. And instead of the DVD logo, which is not licensed for me to use, I will just use some free icon that I find online. This is just a generic free flat icon where I've used the Google tools on the image search to filter by Creative Commons license. All right, so I've just called it icon.png. So I'm going to replace this with icon.png. Is there anywhere else that it uses that? I don't believe so. Let's see if it works. I'll go ahead and open it up in the browser. Not quite. Okay. Are we getting errors? No. So what's going on here? It is bouncing a little bit. Maybe I need it to be more detailed in how I wanted it to bounce. So let me go back to ChatGPT and say, using just, an iterative process here, that the icon is stuttering and not moving across the screen. I want the icon to bounce from one corner of the screen or the window to the other corner. And let's see if it writes me some better JavaScript. Okay, so it says it was intended to bounce around in a random manner, which I guess is a shortcoming of my prompt, not necessarily hitting the corners. So I'll try its new version and see if this does any better. All right, go back to my editor, and I'll just have to replace this with icon.png. I'll refresh the page, and this is what we now end up with. Not good. If we go to the Elements tab, you can see what's going on. It's setting the left and top CSS properties 0 back to -2, it looks like, and then to 0. You can also see it here. And it's flickering. So some of the logic is completely off, because if well, that's weird. If I toggle that myself, it does seem to work for a moment. But there's some weird logic that's getting in the way. Yeah, this is just weird. So there's some bug in there that is completely breaking it. But as soon as I untoggle and change this manually in the DevTools, it does start to work the way that it's supposed to work. So that's one problem. There's a weird bug. The other thing is that it's not very performant to animate the position, so left and top. It'd be much better to do this using something like the transform property and translate it across the screen, translate X and translate Y. So I'm going to go back to ChatGPT and basically start over and tell it, actually, I don't want you to use this approach at all. So down here, let's start over. This time, generate me a website that moves a, what did I call it? Icon.png logo across the screen from one edge to another, maybe I'll say from one corner to another, bouncing like the classic DVD logo. Please animate the position of the logo using the CSS translate property. Technically, it's transform property, translate function. And let's see if that does any better. We get an error. Okay, try it again. We can certainly use transform for smooth animation. Let's see if it does it this time. So it starts to translate 0, 0. That's what I would expect. It's now using icon.png, which is nice. And let's see if that works any better. So I'll just put this whole code in here. Icon.png matches. And I refresh the page. Same bug again. Let's go take a look at the Elements tab. It's doing the same thing where the logic just keeps going between 0 and -2 for some reason. Now, does it work if I toggle this on or off? Nope. So why would it be switching between 0 and -2? Let's actually look at the code now. We're looking at the bounding client rectangle, or rect, basically the available space in the browser. It's also using var. It just does all sorts of weird stuff. If you're a JavaScript developer, you definitely would not be using var. So the next thing I tried was just telling it what was happening. The logo is getting stuck, toggling between translate 0, 0 and translate -2, -2. There's probably some issue with the order that things are happening or the logic that's flipping the speed. So there's an X speed and a Y speed. Basically, once we hit the border of the box, we're supposed to flip the Y speed to be negative of what it currently is. And then when we hit over here, the X speed, we would flip it to be negative to go that way. Same thing with the top and the bottom with Y speed. If we hit the bottom, we're going to flip the Y speed to be the opposite. And if we hit the top, we'll flip it again. So we're multiplying by -1. But there's something happening where it's not working and it's going out of order. So rather than putting some debugging stuff in here and, logging and seeing what's going on, I just said, all right, it's getting stuck. It's oscillating between 0, 0 pixels and -2, -2 pixels. And it rewrote it. It gave me an explanation. It seems the check for the boundary of the screen is happening after the speed of the logo has been adjusted, which could cause it to get stuck between two positions. So it rewrote the code for me. This time, you can see that the speeds are being adjusted first. Then it's checking to see if we've hit the edge of the box or not in the X and Y directions compared to what we had here. So I'm going to replace this, and we cross our fingers and take a look. It seems to be working this time. The logo is getting cut off. That's a whole other issue we can investigate, but it should change directions, at least in the Y direction. Perfect. And we'll let it go a little bit more. Change X direction, now Y direction. It's working exactly the way I wanted it to work. So this video illustrates the iterative process where ChatGPT often is terrible on the first go of things. And it still did all sorts of weird, just dated stuff, like using var all over the place. And trying to animate something initially using top and left. These are not performant properties. It's much better to animate something using the transform property because of the browser paint process. It's also cutting off my image. Oh, just because it set a height, and I set the height to be 100 pixels. Okay, now we can see the whole icon. As I was saying, though, you have to stay on top of it. You have to iterate and work with it, but you can get an end result eventually. I mean, I still would want to split this into multiple files and not do, style tag directly in my HTML, not do a script tag where it's filled with inline JavaScript, but it does work. It just takes some finagling, going back and forth with it, saying, can you please not use this outdated syntax? There's a bug. It's not working at all. It's stuck in the same place. That wasn't enough information. Right? I tried that first. Then, after it failed again, I gave it a specific situation that was causing the problem, which was that the translate property was going from 0 to -2 back and forth, which is what we identified just as a developer. You'd look in the dev tools, you'd see that, and that could give you some context. And if we didn't have ChatGPT, that would have been our first sign as to why something was going wrong. Some logic flipping the direction keeps messing up. And that was enough of a hint for ChatGPT to figure it out. So it's an iterative process. Next, I want to show you a slightly larger application. It's still not very large, but it's, 5 or 6 files. It's a web app, a server, there's a database involved. It's basic authentication, but really nothing impressive. But it's a step up from what we've done so far, a DVD logo moving around on a screen. And instead of coding it along with you, it could be like an hour-long video. I think it's just a waste of your time. I went ahead and built it on my own using ChatGPT. There's a whole bunch of chat stuff here. And I just want to walk you through some of the issues I ran into, some of the iterative chat that I've mentioned a whole bunch of times in this section that works best when you're trying to get ChatGPT to write you code, especially when that code is complicated and interconnected instead of just a one-off function or script. Okay, so what I wanted it to do is build me a link or a URL shortener, a very dumbed-down version of something like Bitly, where you can provide a long URL, and then it takes that long URL, stores it in a database, along with a shortened version that it generates, right? A unique short link, and then I can use that short link to visit my long link. And I, this time around, decided to use Python with Flask and SQLite. And I use SQLite just to keep it simpler, not having to worry about, database authentication or something with MySQL. Okay, so the first thing I said is really short. I want to implement a simple URL shortener using Python. I'd like to use Flask and SQLite. And it immediately just started going. And this time around, it did tell me a bit about what I needed to install, although it didn't mention virtual environments, creating a requirements file for pip. There's some things it left off. But again, this is for experienced developers anyway. It's mostly just highlighting the key points. Here's a basic project structure. And then it did something that confused me a tiny bit. It gave me one version of app.py with some imports and my basic server. And then it gave me another version of app.py. And what confused me for a moment is that it's also importing Flask, just like it was in this version. So I just followed up saying, is this one file, two files? Further down here. And it said, I apologize for the confusion. They should be in the same file, and it consolidated the imports and gave me everything together. It would have been simple enough to figure out. It wasn't some crazy issue, but it just had some overlap. Then it also gave me a couple of really basic templates, index.html, url.html, where it eventually is going to render the shortened URL. And then it told me, here's how you run your application. Sure. Although I usually use Flask run instead of Python app.py. Fine enough. It gave me some explanation, told me to replace the test database URL with the location of my actual SQLite database, set my Flask environment variables, and then, it actually did tell me to use Flask run, even though it told me to use Python up here. Slightly confusing, but simple enough to figure out. Okay. Then I ran into a legitimate issue, which is it wrote code that caused an error. It was a pretty simple error to fix, but this is the error I was getting down here, working outside of application context. And this is coming from SQL Alchemy, Flask SQL Alchemy, which is the library that connects SQL to Flask, or one of the libraries that does that. And it all stems from this line. So it figured it out just fine. This is a very simple thing to fix. It basically just put this line db.createAll on its own, which is invalid. It does not work that way. And if you looked at the SQL Alchemy docs, it'd be the first thing you could identify as a developer anyway. So another example of it writing incorrect code that with a tiny little nudge, just showing it the error message, it solved. It rewrote the code correctly, and it modifies it so that it runs the line now right here with app.appContext, which is the correct way of running db.createAll. Okay, then I asked it some more questions to update the template so that I could put localhost in here, because right now it's, I'm not hosting this anywhere except locally on my machine. Not a big deal, simple enough. Then I asked it to generate me some simple HTML and make it look great. I don't know if it made it look great, but it wrote me some styles. It tends to favor putting inline styling, or not inline, but an inline style tag, which is obnoxious. I just went with it for the sake of time. This took me, an hour of playing around with to generate this whole chat transcript. Anyway, it puts the CSS right in the template, kind of annoying, but easy enough to solve. It writes some styles, and the styles look pretty okay, and they're organized well enough, and I was happy enough with those. And then further down, kept going, gave me another template, and it claims that it gives them a clean, modern look, but they're quite simple, and that they're for demonstration purposes only, and that it wants me to use Tailwind or Bootstrap for more comprehensive styles. Okay, then I just asked it, what other features can I add? And it suggested authentication. It also suggested possibly adding testing. So I asked it to write me some tests, write a basic but comprehensive test suite. So it told me to install Flask-testing, and then it told me to make a testapp.py file. It's using unit tests, Flask testing, and it writes some basic tests. And they work decently well. I tried them out. It was fine. The logic of my application is dead simple. You provide a URL and you get back a short URL, and that's pretty much it. There's not a whole lot to test other than that. Then it gives me a super long explanation of how the tests work. And then I told it to add some simple authentication. So this is one of those things where, auth is a pain for a lot of people, and it would be nice to turn to something like ChatGPT to get help with. But you have to be careful, because it's one thing if you get a function that seems to work, but it actually has bugs. It's another thing if you take authentication code that's supposed to protect your application and it has a bug baked in or it doesn't work. It could cause a lot of problems. The stakes are higher, I guess that's what I'm trying to say with authentication. But it did an okay job. It told me to use Flask login, so install that, update my app.py to have some authentication logic in here using Flask login. It adds in a login method, a logout method, looks fine enough, a load user helper. And it did a pretty good job, at least getting the authentication up and running. It adds my forms in, but then it got an error again. Create all got an unexpected keyword argument app. And if you look where this is coming from, right here, create all app equals app. This is exactly what it told me to do. And then I told it, wait, that gave me an error. And it immediately apologizes. Another instance of it making a mistake, introducing a bug, using incorrect syntax. But when it's called out, it says, oh, wait a minute, the correct usage of that create all method does not include any params. And it tells me to change it from what it suggested to this right here, db.createAll. And also, once again, wrap it inside of this context. So just a small little bug here or there that if you don't know what you're doing, could be annoying to fix, but I would never suggest somebody who's a complete beginner try and use ChatGPT to make an application in the first place. If you are a developer, though, it can help. Then I said, all right, we have authentication. Theoretically, right, we have our routes, but there's no way to actually register. And it said, oh, I assumed you would manually add users to the database. So then it gave me a register route. It created the template for me. I went through all of this, and it works fine enough. You can register. But then I got another error, template not found. And it turned out that it was redirecting me to a route and a template that didn't exist. It keeps referencing home, which it never told me to actually create. And so then eventually, once I told it, hey, there's no home.html file, I got this error, it responds, oh, you need to make that file. Here's what could go in that file. So just a little nudging in the right direction, iterating, kind of working with it, being a supervisor, you can get some good results. And that's where I left off. And I'll just briefly show you that it does kind of work for the most part. I'm currently logged in. Let me log out. If I try and go to the root page, just slash, it keeps redirecting me to login. So that is a protected route. If we go back to the app.py, the home route, where are you? Right here, has the login required decorator on it. Okay, so if I try and go to the home page, it doesn't work. I can't shorten URLs unless I'm logged in. So let's register. I'll register with my dog's name, Elton, and then I'll put a password. A really weak one matches his username of Elton. Okay, kind of annoying. It just redirects me to the login page, which it's simple enough to, we could ask it for help on that. But I'll log back in as Elton. And now it takes me to the URL shortener. This is the protected route I couldn't visit. Now I'll provide a URL like this is just from my personal webpage for one of my free courses. I'll put that in here. It's not that long of a URL anyway, but imagine it is long. And I'm going to shorten it. And this is when it generates me. And when I click on this, it does in fact take me to the correct URL. Although it's displaying the wrong URL, it's not displaying the local host that it needs to use. It's just doing HTTP. That's easy enough to change, right? It's just in the template, but it is working. So that's not bad. The styles are okay, right? I can shorten another URL. I can log out. Some of the routes are protected by authentication, but it's not perfect. I mean, I actually just asked it, what are some security issues or problems with the current authentication setup? And one big one is that there's no validation on your registration. You can register with the same email over and over and over, and there's no error handling whatsoever. There's no session management, really. The secret key is hard-coded right now into the application. So just a lot of things that in the real world would be real problems, but it's at least able to highlight them. So you just have to be aware, right? This is not a friendly process for a complete beginner. You could make a really bad, very vulnerable and buggy application if you don't know how to code. If you do know what you're doing and you oversee it, you manage ChatGPT, you can get pretty far. I mean, this took me, I said an hour, it's probably more like 40 minutes to get a basic app up and running with authentication, a database, 4 or 5 routes, 4 or 5 templates, what else? Redirection, some authorization, plus the URL shortening logic, plus a couple of tests. So that might take me twice as long to do if I was doing it myself without ChatGPT. And I'm going to end this video here. I'm still not happy with a lot of things. CSS directly in the HTML templates obnoxious. The lack of any sort of validations, not to mention client-side validations for the authentication, that all sucks. No error handling, but it's just a matter of revisiting ChatGPT and telling it what we want, right? My next step could easily be, okay, let's add some registration validation. I'm not going to do it, but registration. Oh gosh. I think it's, yeah. My spelling is terrible. I'm sorry. Let's add some registration validation. Let's check if the username already exists. Simple things that if you've ever written authentication, you would know to do, at least if you've used any of these libraries, but it's pretty basic. Look to see if, the email or the username Elton exists in the database first. If so, we're going to respond back and flash a message saying username already exists, redirect them back to the register page. Also, we could add some client-side validations with JavaScript, but that's it. It is definitely possible to get a lot out of ChatGPT as a developer assistant, a helper, but you're not going to get very far if you're relying on it exclusively. As we've already seen, it introduced 2 or 3 completely invalid lines of code that broke the application more than once.